A while back, you may have seen a video about an Intellivision I purchased, which was listed as untested on eBay. It came as a lot, including 10 boxed games and a voice synthesis module that was also boxed. Considering that the Intellivision was released in 1979, I translated untested as being faulty. But to my pleasant surprise, it worked as intended, even if a bit of inexperienced troubleshooting was required on my end. While the console was in complete working order, I still had to deal with the fact that it could only output in RF. I dislike RF, both for its inconvenience and its quality. Luckily, it is possible to mod the console so it can output composite instead. There are also options out there for RGB, but as of recording, the pre-built modules are difficult to locate. So, mentioning pre-built modules, I should add that these are available for composite output too. However, it is a relatively simple circuit and inflation is spicy, so why don't we build one from scratch? It's much cheaper and arguably more fun. You do like fun, don't you? I'm no engineer, however. I'm building and installing this circuit thanks to the IntelliWiki. Linked below, you'll find a page with a schematic and detailed instructions on how to do so. We have the efforts of Tim Linder and Joe, Zed to thank for making this possible. Let's get started. Here's everything you need to construct the circuit. They do list shielded coaxial wire on the wiki, and while I did obtain this, I totally forgot I had it later and just used standard hookup wire instead. Spoiler for later in the video, that still works fine. Next, we need a perf board to mount and connect everything. I would like to delve into circuit design and printing at some point, but that's beyond the scope of this video. Today, we'll be kicking it old school. Not sure what perf board is? Ask your granddad. Now for the components. A bunch of different resistors are required, 8 in total and all of different values. Two 2N3904 transistors are also needed, as well as 4 100 microfarad capacitors. Obviously, we'll need RCA connectors to plug the composite cable into, and the before mentioned hookup wire. Realistically, this is only a few bucks worth of components all up. I had most on hand already, except for the 22 ohm resistor. I would be trying my luck with a 33 ohm resistor instead, because what's 11 ohms between friends? Following the schematic, I began laying out the components before soldering, trying my best to be efficient with space. The majority of this is for the video output, although this separate section will deal with audio. Once I was happy with the layout, I soldered the components' legs into place before snipping off the excess. I then checked with a multimeter that there were no connections between the pads, which in this case were essentially globs of solder since this is far from a modern circuit board. Several breaks in the traces were required, as per the schematic. I initially attempted slicing the traces with a box cutter, but had no luck. They're tougher than they appear. I don't build circuits like this too often, but I eventually remembered that I used a drill last time and this worked like a charm. This was followed by a quick check with the multimeter to be sure that the trace was truly broken, and we were more or less finished. With the circuit in what I thought was a finished state, no foreshadowing or anything, it was time to disassemble the Intellivision so we could install it. In a nutshell, this is very straightforward, but then becomes incredibly fiddly. The two halves of the case separate by the removal of 6 Phillip head screws. As you're separating the top half, remove the controllers from their holders and wrangle them through the gap since they're seemingly hardwired in. Move the controllers to the side for now, but unwind their cables that snake through the circuitry. I'd recommend taking a photo of exactly how they're installed before doing so. It will make reassembly much easier later on. Now, remove the 6 Phillip head screws that are holding this bracket in place. There are 4 connectors to disconnect, 2 of which are for the controllers. I guess they're not so hardwired after all. I found it easier to slightly angle up the mainboard for better access. I started with this controller port at the top. Be sure to pull on the connector itself, not the very thin and delicate wires. Pull any of those out and you're in for a bad time. Next, there are 2 connections to the power board. The 2-prong connector that's actually just one wire is straightforward, but exercise caution with the also delicate 40-year-old ribbon cable. I certainly held my breath every time I was required to plug and unplug that. Once those 2 are disconnected, you'll then have much easier access to the second controller port. Again, wire pulling is not allowed. The mainboard is now free, but it is here the real work begins. Bafflingly, this is encapsulated between 2 RF shields that are soldered together. We'll need to remove the darker half to access points on the mainboard where the composite mod will be soldered to. My first thought was to use my desoldering station, but this wasn't really working out as I had intended. So I attempted to melt the solder while prying with a flat-headed screwdriver. This didn't really work either, so I went back to the desoldering station. I had luck by removing just enough solder to break the bridge between the 2 shields, and then bending the tabs with a screwdriver. This could also be achieved by using braid if you don't own a desoldering station. It took a lot of time and patience, but I finally removed that dang shield. Fortunately, the smaller shield can stay on. Access to that side of the circuit board is not required for this mod. Since I won't be using RF moving forward, however, hence the reason for this mod, there will be no reason to reattach the shield we did remove. With that out of the way, it was time to start wiring. I began by attaching the inputs and outputs to the composite board using the hookup wire. On the Intellivision side, I gleamed power and ground from the base of that fragile ribbon cable. Pin 1 on the very left is 5 volts, while pin 4 is ground. I added fresh solder to these points first, which made attaching the relevant wires easier. Video and audio signals come straight from the RF modulator. The pin closest to the edge is video, while 2 pins across, you'll find audio. This image from the wiki illustrates that more plainly. I soldered 2 of the RCA jacks to the composite board, one for video and one for audio, and then plugged the Intellivision back together for a test. Ensure nothing is shorting on anything else, as this form factor for testing can be quite haphazard. Moment of truth. I plugged it in, turned it on, and nothing. I then recalled from the unboxing video that you need to hit the reset button after turning it on to initiate the game. To achieve this while disassembled, I stuck a plastic spudger down a hole to flex a metal contact, but still, there was nothing but a blank screen. After more pondering and studying of the circuit diagram, I realized I'd installed the transistors the wrong way around. That's most definitely a rookie mistake, but I was relieved to think I had found the solution. Except, I hadn't. All this did was result in the image flickering on the screen for the slightest amount of time. So slight in fact that the camera barely even registered it. That's okay. Deep breath. Here we go, let the troubleshooting begin. Studying my components and the schematic, I immediately thought of the 33 ohm resistor that was supposed to be 22 ohms. Even with my limited technical knowledge, I didn't feel this would be an issue. But not wanting to rule anything out, I soldered 2 10 ohm resistors in series. Unsurprisingly, this was a no-go, it just made my circuit look that extra bit dorky. Since I had initially installed the transistors the wrong way around, I considered that I may have fried them. So I desoldered them for a second time and checked them. They appeared to be in full working order however, so back in they went. I then partook in a sanity check by booting up the Intellivision with RF, just to be sure there weren't any external issues. The static was quite bad, probably because one of the RF shields was removed, but it was indeed still working. So, the ultimate problem? Well, yeah, more incompetence on my behalf, obviously. Like I said, I'm no engineer, so I did eventually discover a few more mistakes in the construction of the circuit. Not only were the transistors backwards, but I didn't connect these resistors to this capacitor. Additionally, I installed 2 of the capacitors on the same trace with no break, so they were essentially shorting out on themselves. Luckily, they seemed fine, because after fixing those issues, I had a working composite mod. Hooray!
Hooray!
With everything in working order, it was time to cut the circuit down to size. I scored both sides of the perf board where I wanted it to break, and then snapped it over my desk's hard edge. That felt a bit dicey and a point where everything could go wrong, but it luckily came out pretty clean. It was now time to drill holes in the case for the composite video and audio outputs. Since these will go under the power circuit, we'll need to temporarily move that out of the way. That's easily achieved by removing 2 Phillip head screws, but be cautious. Handle it carefully and never touch anywhere near it while it's plugged in. In fact, as a general rule, don't touch anything while the system is plugged in. After I sussed out placement for the RCA sockets, I drilled a small pilot hole. This was then followed by the correct size drill bit. This varies from manufacturer to manufacturer of the socket, so I recommend measuring its width with calipers first. I ran into more trouble here however. I couldn't screw the socket in place. As a nice change, for once, this wasn't my fault. Long story short, I had a crappy component. The nut wouldn't screw on the thread from the very top, so there wasn't enough thread to secure the socket in place. After a trip to the shops for some higher quality gear, which basically entailed me visiting Altronics instead of J-Car, we had the yellow jack in place. After installing the other 2 jacks, which looks like this and looks like this with a cable, I finished off the final wiring. The Intellivision only includes mono audio, so I sent the same signal to both red and white jacks to simulate a stereo connection. It was then just a case of reinstalling the power board, plugging the various connectors back in, reassembling everything else, and we were ready for the final test. Okay, it works. Thanks for watching, bye!